So there's three things I want to do today. Today I want to go through just some basic concepts on this week's assignment. And if you look on this week's assignment, you can maybe follow along with some of the questions just with the background that I'm going to give on agriculture, industrial expansion, and labor. So the first thing that I want to get into is what was happening in the post-bellum era from really about 1870 to 1910 or 1915, just before World War I. And agriculture is one of those things that I think really has a big impact on American economic history during this period of time. Now, if you'll remember from your readings and from some of the things that I posted on the internet, we were looking at the productive capacity, especially in agriculture, being pretty much decimated through the Civil War. A lot of the farming lands became battlefields, as you know, and a lot of the productive capabilities with manufacturing was totally decimated. So it was a rebuilding process, and it wasn't necessarily a fair rebuilding process. We had a number of folks who took advantage of the situation, and that made it very difficult. So one of the things that we kind of want to take a look at is, what characteristics can we assign to agriculture during that period of time? And several things were happening. It was rebuilding those farming lands that were there before, but also, as we've read, it's also expanding the land mass that was dedicated to agriculture. And there are a number of acts that were taking place during that period of time that I'll talk about in just a minute. But if we were to ask the question, which of the following statements correctly characterizes changes in the farming and agricultural land during the period between 1870 and the 1900s, we'd have to say that agricultural prices started to decline. And they declined for a couple of different reasons. And when we use economic reasoning, we want to take a look at that traditional supply and demand. Yes, there was a great demand for things that are going on, but at the same time, we were looking at increasing supply by these land policies that were being pushed further westward and what have you. And so anytime you have an excess of supply, we know that that's going to drive prices down. So through this period, we saw a couple of things. Initially, we saw the prices of farm and agriculture goods significantly going down, putting a lot of the farming families in jeopardy. And of course, during that period of time, on up probably through the 1940s and 50s, but especially during this period of time, a significant portion of the population had some tie to farming. And initially, if you go way back, the farmers were mainly supporting their own families and what have you. But during the pre-Civil War and post-Civil War, they were starting to become more business type and enterprises. And because of the manufacturing, the machinery, and those kinds of things that they could use in the farm, they were becoming more productive. So on the one hand, you had an increase in supply based on new lands coming in, but also the new technology and the new capital equipment that was being put into the market itself. All of those things increase supply. And when you have an increase in supply, it tends to drive prices down. So we had those kinds of things happening. Another question that we've got in this week's assignment is, which of the following pieces of legislation represent a liberalization of federal policy? And when we look at that, there's three main policies that we want to take a look at. Number one is the Homestead Act of 1862. And the Homestead Act of 1862 was signed by President Lincoln, and it provided 160 acres for every family to move westward as an incentive to increase. And that was one of the things that increased the supply, as I mentioned before, of the land itself. The next one was the Desert Land Act. And here again, families could buy land for 25 cents an acre in the arid parts of the United States. And again, that was an incentive to get people to move out to these desert or semi-desert areas. Now they had to pay the 25 cents, but they also had to commit by contract to aerate, to irrigate, and to make that land productive. And then the third one was the Timber and Stone Act. And the Timber and Stone Act was implemented in 1878. And that, again, looked at those areas that probably weren't good farm areas, but still wanted to move people out. And it was for mining and timber and lumber excavation. So one of the next questions that we want to take a look at is, what problems did the farmers face? And based on what we just said, because of the low prices, there was concern that they could even have a going concern, that they could make a living and commit to all of their increasing costs. And again, when you go back and think that if I'm farming with my hand plow for my family, that's tough and I can probably feed them. But what was happening at the time is they were expanding with these 160 acres and even more land and what have you, and they had to sell their goods and services. To sell those farm goods, they went into debt in many cases to buy the more sophisticated machinery that was needed to run a larger concern. And so it was the interest that they were paying, it was the cost of the land itself that they were looking at, the cost of raw materials, and then shipping. If you are producing more grain, for example, and looking at producing more than just your local area, you've got to ship. And so the farmers really accused the bankers and the financiers, the transportation folks, and grain operators for jacking the prices up, but paying them less, so they would have a greater profitability. The other thing that was happening that really drove prices down is at one point in time, the United States farmers were able to ship a lot of their farm goods, especially cotton and some of those down in the South, to other areas of the world. During this period of time that our farmers were becoming more productive, farmers in other areas were also becoming more productive in parts of the world. And so again, that supply is increasing, and their exports, at least in the first part of the 1870s to about the 1890s, suffered from those lower prices. And then during the second half of the 19th century, the export demand for US farm goods started to increase. Here we're looking at, because of these lower prices, they're able to ship greater quantity, and the demand, and I think because of the quality too, started to go up. So another question that is in the assignment that you might want to take a look at is, before the nation's first Transcontinental Railroad was complete, travelers on the Pacific coast and in the Midwest and what have you relied on what types of transportation? And if we look at the transportation that we've already studied, we looked at waterways and ships and wagons. The waterways were really good in the eastern part, the northeastern part, all the way down to Louisiana with the Mississippi River. But as we moved further west, we had to rely on overland transportation, the roads and what have you. So prior to the Transcontinental Railroad, it was the wagons, which was more expensive and more time consuming and what have you. So that really urged the development of the Transcontinental Railroad. And we're familiar here in Utah with Promontory Point. Is the railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad, started from the East Coast and the West Coast and started to join together. Well, there was a lot of development on the east side with railroads anyway, but as you try to have a point where they meet, the greatest development was in the Great Plains area, and that's because it's flat and there's no difficulty as there is in the Rocky Mountains for building and excavating. There's a number of industrialists that came out, and they were stepped forward. They've been called the captains of industry, but they've also been called the robber barons. And it's kind of the complementary versus the negativity of individuals. These individuals, however, did develop the industries that then pushed us from the 1870s to pre-World War I. And I've listed 4 in the assignment. One is Henry Ford, John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan. And I'm just asking you to match their industries that they developed or they've been credited with developing. So I'll ask you to match those in the assignment. And then between 1870 and 1920, the U.S. labor force actually started to grow, but they grew at a greater rate, continued to grow really, it didn't start to grow, at a greater rate than the population. And so that's kind of an interesting thing to dig into to take a look at that. How did the labor force increase by a greater rate than the population? And a lot of that is answered by, yes, the population coming in, but people coming from foreign lands and what have you to add to the population rate. And you got to realize that during this period of time, we had a lot of migration coming in from different areas of the world. Not only because there were opportunities here in the United States, and that was the word that was spreading throughout different parts of the world, from Asia to Europe, that there are greater opportunities here with the land opportunities and with the ownership opportunities and the inventive part of it, but also because in their home areas, they were suffering from famines and they were suffering from, in many cases, oppression. And so again, they're trying to find a better life for them and their families. So you have primarily natural growth in the population with families, young children and what have you. They're not entering the labor force. The labor force growing at a faster rate, it can be attributed to the fact that we have a lot of working age men and working age women coming into the United States to help the economy and to develop and grow the nation. So another question that I pose is, by the 20th century, the largest sector in the US economy in terms of commodities output was in manufacturing. And so here we see a shift, because the largest component in the early history of the United States was agriculture, and now it has shifted to the first part of the 20th century, so beginning in 1900, really 1880 and 1890, to manufacturing. The manufacturing and the growth in manufacturing during this period of time worldwide was significant. When I say significant, by the eve of World War I, the United States was producing 30% of the world's manufacturing or productivity. Okay, so that's kind of the review of the assignment. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, so one of the things that I do, as you know, is I put out not only the study material and what have you, where you read it in the book, and I put in my own videos and those kinds of things, but each week I put out a set of slides that talk about a certain aspect. So last week I had American Antebellum. So a question is, the modules say that the assignment is due Sunday. Is that accurate? Yes, it is. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to go over this, to give you a leg up on completing that assignment. Oh, the midterm assignment? I'm going to go back and check. I think that I gave an extra week for that. So I will go back and check that tonight. And I will commit that I'll give you an extra week. So it won't be due this Sunday, but it'll be due the next Sunday. Okay. So anyway, last week I did one on the antebellum economy. I want to hit the Gilded Age, because this period, or at least part of this period, has been labeled by Mark Twain as the Gilded Age. And I have some information out there in a different slide set. But the one I'm going to go through today kind of gets us to, why was he calling it the Gilded Age? And the real answer is, and his own answer in the book he wrote, and comes from his book, is that on the surface it appeared as though the streets were paved with gold, that we had defeated poverty, that anybody who wanted to be rich could be rich. And part of that is because of the discovery of gold and silver in the West, and the fact that people could go, and everybody tried to get rich in mining, but it created all kinds of industries that supported the mining effort and the transportation of people going to the West. And so there was really the thought that we had defeated the poverty and that people could be extremely rich with what they're doing. That only moved the United States population out into different areas, but it also accelerated the immigration. So during that period of time also, there was a big increase, as we've already talked about, with technological and agricultural goods. One of the things that was happening is these land acts not only provided land for people to move and the incentive for people to move, but the government also created land grant colleges. And I'm sure that you're familiar with some of these land grant colleges. Utah State is one of those. Agriculture and technology, Texas A&T. And so what they were doing is looking, how do we become more productive in farming? One of the big topics during the late 1700s and 1800s was that, can we continue to feed a growing population? The population is growing so much. Thomas Malthus, for example, was one who said, we're going to starve ourselves because we won't be able to feed ourselves given the production of food. And so that technology was not only in universities and in farming colleges and in the technological aspects of machinery that helps overall production, but it's one thing that increased that overall production that I talked about before. It was also a period where we saw the emergence of big business. Now, historically, what you saw in towns and what have you is small shops owned by individuals and sometimes families. And because transportation was limited or more expensive, the goods that they produced were only distributed in a very small area. But with the transportation of industry and railroads and also steel and banking to finance all of this, big businesses started to emerge. And those were the captains of industry that I talked about. They were ones who were willing to put together steel mills and develop oil and railroads and those kinds of things. But also, as the demand for more products increased, so did the derived demand for workers. And when I say workers are a derived demand, I want to explain that just a minute. What we say is, if there is a demand for skateboards, for example, there is a derived demand for skateboard manufacturers, those individuals who are going to take the decks and the trucks and everything and put them together. There's not a demand per se for someone who can use a wrench unless they can use that wrench for a product. And because of the high demand for these products and the best new thing that came out, you wouldn't have that demand for workers. But innovation was going so quickly and growing so quickly that there was a huge demand for these workers. I've got down here that in 1892, 164,000 workers organized 1,298 strikes. So while there was a demand for workers and they were coming into these big organizations and kind of being absorbed into this, conditions weren't always great. And so what you also had during this period of time is not only the development of big business, but also the development of labor and labor movements and even labor unions. And when these businesses were being developed, there was no safety standards. The government didn't come in and identify OSHA or minimum wage or child labor laws or anything like that. And so there were a number of accidents. And if you were hurt in a mining accident or a steel mill accident, what have you, it was too bad. There was nothing to fall back on. And so because of these things, you had now people who are organizing labor unions. And as you see, the 164,000 workers organizing 1,098 strikes for better working conditions and higher wages. Two things going on: tremendous growth in big business, but also depended on labor and the labor rights movement starting to come into view. It facilitated both social and political transformation. And what I mean by that is, as people moved from the farm and had that close relationship with families and a network in a small town and what have you, many people were lost in that kind of a thing. And so it required almost political activity to change working conditions, to identify people who really didn't have the means to support themselves. And so social and political transformation was going on at the same time. We were developing new types of systems to better society, if I can put it that way. And then innovation that improved Americans' living standards included the railroad, obviously, because it was able to take goods and services to areas that hadn't been there before. And when I say improve the standard of living, we're talking about the improvement in waterways and drinking water and mining and those kinds of things. The development of the electric motor and the electric light bulb. All of these things joined together to increase that standard of living. And again, if you think back thousands of years, most people lived a subsistence level of existence, except the royalty and those types of individuals. And still, they didn't have a great life, I don't think, living in cold castles and what have you. I say that kind of tongue in cheek. But for most the population, 95% of the population lived as serfs and what have you. And so comparing that to where we are with these innovations and what have you, the standard of living, I think no doubt increased. Also, the industrial growth was guided by the concept of laissez-faire capitalism. And here again, where I've talked about the captains of industry or the robber barons themselves, it took some individuals to step out and do this. It wasn't government, it was individuals who said, here's an opportunity, we should take care of that. Now, they're called the robber barons for a couple of different reasons. Number one, that they had such power that they could take advantage of workers and they could take advantage of smaller folks, smaller producers. So John D. Rockefeller, who was the credited with the development of the oil industry, wasn't an oil man himself, didn't do the diggings and what have you, but he was an organizer. And he organized a lot of the smaller oil producers to come together, and then he would arrange transportation and he would arrange for the sale of their oil and what have you. And so he put together what then became Standard Oil, not as a company, but as a cooperative. And, you know, sometimes the feeling from, as I mentioned with the farmers earlier, with some of these oil producers is that he didn't do any of the work, we did the work, he facilitated the sale, yes, but he got a bigger share than we did. So that was where that term came from, not necessarily just for John Rockefeller, but for these individuals. So part of what labor was demanding when they were doing their strikes and what have you was for better working conditions, better pay, and these sometimes led to violent confrontations. And it was interesting because the federal government took on a couple of different stances. Sometimes in the earlier part supporting the factory owners and what have you. And as the sentiments changed in the United States itself, then to support the workers. Initially, if we look at a couple of different places like the Homestead strike and the Pullman strike, Homestead was a steel industry and Pullman was a train, was within the train industry. As they went on strike, the owners of the Homestead Act hired the Pinkertons to come in, and they were violent confrontations. And government really didn't do a whole lot, and sometimes even governors would call in the state militia to put down a strike or a conflict or something like that. The federal government, as I mentioned here, struggled to protect both sides and sometimes came out stronger on one than another. When we get down to about the Theodore Roosevelt era, then we had a number of things that were happening that supported the workers rather than to try to balance out the industry, not necessarily turning their back on the industry, but to balance out that industry. And Theodore Roosevelt, as I have down here, threatened to take over control of the mines as one of the more drastic measures if the owners did not start bargaining in good faith. And so this struggle that matched the increase in the overall industrial capacity of the nation and the number of workers coming in, worker safety, higher wages, more fair wages, and what have you, was something that we saw during this period. The Gilded Age, on the surface, it looks like we're doing so much, we're very productive. There are big mansions being built for these tycoons, if I can put it that way. And the standard of living in the normal household is also increasing with some of these innovations and what have you. So on the outside, it looked like everything's gilded, everything is good and what have you, but there's a lot of corruption and a lot of decay as you dig down and find out, exactly what's happening. The interesting thing that I look at is I look at it today. These are still some of the same struggles. Now we've learned a lot, and I think we've changed a lot. We have federal laws and regulations that protect workers and outlaw child labor laws and some of those kinds of things. But some of the core elements are still something that we've got to deal with. Okay. Was that helpful? Anybody have any comments? Okay, as I said, I will take a look at the due date on the midterm. I set that some time ago, so that's why I have to go take a look at it. But I will commit that I will not have it this Sunday, but the Sunday after that. And I will put out a study guide for the midterm so you have an idea what you should be looking at before you open it up. Okay, anybody have anything else? All right, then I'm going to end this. And if you have any questions or if you have any concerns, then just let me know. Send me a email. All right. I will we're going to do a Zoom next week. No on-campus class. Tonight was an on-campus and Zoom, and you had your choice. The college has determined that we're not going to have any on-campus activities after Thanksgiving. So from that point on till the final, everything will be done electronically, online, rather than on campus. And I just want to give you forewarning on that. That's still several weeks away. But next week is a totally Zoom classroom, and we'll hold it at, it's on the schedule. You can take a look at all the Zoom connectivities I have, including office hours if you want to do one-on-one. And what I have done on one-on-one, as you know, probably no different than most other professors, is you will log in, you will be put into a waiting room. I will admit people one at a time so we can talk about your grades or any concerns that you might have. All right. Thanks, everyone. No more comments. I'll give you one more chance. All right.